Guys, Citlali is the second 5-star that came out in the 5.3 patch, and she's definitely a character that deserves a lot of attention. In my pre-release video about her, I said that while Mavuika is the star of the update, there are situations where you might want to pull for Citlali instead. And everything I've seen from her post-release confirmed these thoughts from me, with some surprises even. Without further ado, let's dive into it. So, the reasons that make Citlali great are actually pretty straightforward. She's a character that can buff Hydra and Pyro damage dealers in the meta through the resistance reduction effects and Cinder City. While doing that, she provides a rather decent shield for the team and enough cryo application to trigger freeze or enable melt reactions consistently. As a result, she has a place in some of the top teams in the meta from an offensive standpoint, while also being able to provide some cool defensive utility that most of the time will be enough to keep your units alive. I will go step by step here to analyze my findings post-release. First, I actually want to talk about her shield, since it's the most questionable part of her kit. In terms of base values, it's not that great, definitely much less impressive than Layla or Zhongli's shield, for example, and if you use builds on her that prioritize the offensive output of the team, like for example her holding Trilling Tails, you will definitely feel the fragility of it. However, there are ways to reinforce her defensive output while still maintaining the main chunk of her offensive value. A weapon that pleasantly surprised me is Sacrificial Fragments. At Refinement 5, Fragments will reset the cooldown of her skill once a rotation rather consistently, and in those scenarios, Citlali will be able to generate a whole 10 particles for herself practically instantly. This basically nullifies her energy requirements and allows her to invest completely on Elemental Mastery, which makes her shield a bit more respectable. Anyway, what I also wasn't sure about in pre-release is that casting her skill a second time gives her a second bump of Night Soul points, which is enough to push her above the 50 points threshold she requires to initiate her field effect. This kind of replaces what the burst does in terms of Night Soul points generation, and it can be very useful in the case you want to speed things up a bit, as the second skill is naturally much faster than using the burst. Secondarily, even when you're not holding fragments, she feels pretty good in terms of energy recovery on some teams. Xilonen does the trick, because she has a passive that instantly triggers a Night Soul burst, on top of the fact that as a Nathan character she facilitates Night Soul burst to begin with. This makes Citlali recover a lot of energy per rotation on teams with Xilonen, granted she's holding the Cinder City set. And in general, that's kind of the reason why, to me, even if you have multiple Nathan supports on your team, the Cinder City set should always go on Citlali, because the burst is very important for her rotations. Options like Tenacity can be good in those scenarios technically, like if you have Xilonen on team, you can give Cinder City to Xilonen and Tenacity to Citlali to make her shield stronger, but this becomes a quite annoying solution when you realize the significance of your Citlali getting 12 or 18 less flat energy per rotation. Still, Sacrificial Fragments is an exception here because of how much energy it generates, and in combination with Tenacity or Instructor, it makes her shield quite strong. The supportive effects of the sets will be good for a number of teams, so this is a legitimate archetype for her. Next in the list of things that make Citlali good comes her cryo application. But first, let me remind you that if you enjoy my content but haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really makes me notice your support, and also go check my Instagram and TikTok accounts. In pre-release, I assumed she would function as the sole cryo support for some pyro carries, but she will kind of require double cryo cores for others that are more demanding in that sense. Turns out that, excluding some extreme cases like Hu Tao, she's perfectly usable as the sole cryo support on a team across the board, with some asterisks though. Even with pre-existent pyro application from a character like Bennett, she can pretty quickly set up cryo application for the carry to melt, and then after that she will be applying pretty consistently every other hit. What's really noticeable at first is that the range is honestly really impressive for a cryo support, as it's a wide circular area that follows the active character and hits the enemies within it. If you played a melt theme such as this before, you probably have tried out a core like Diona and Rosaria, maybe for a carry like Gaming. These themes are really impressive in terms of sealing, but they require the enemy to stay within those circular bursts of theirs, so they've always been rather risky to play. Citlali really one-ups them in this regard, and this makes the melt themes much more accessible, even for the more casual players. It's not always flawless though. Characters like Mavuika and Arlecchino still need to stagger some of their combo chains to preserve the melt consistency. In the case of Mavuika, I went over it in her own video, but you basically have to interrupt her charge attack combo after the 4th hit at most, either by jumping midway through the rotation or by using a finisher after the 3rd charge attack. With Arlecchino, you're forced to use 3 normal attacks in a loop, and even then you can't just do it mindlessly. You have to pause sometimes to allow the cryo application to keep up, and these timings vary depending on how the opponent moves around on the field. The returns make these struggles more than worth it, however, as pretty much all the pyro carries that fit on Melt teams stepped up in the meta and are posting team damage results higher than ever before. I think the one that benefited the most out of the existing carries is Gaming. Gaming is pretty much built for Melt teams because he attacks every 2 or 3 seconds, kinda like Molani is built for Vape teams, and even before Citlali, his Melt teams always were very impressive in terms of speedruns and such. Citlali now opens up this potential for the entire player base pretty much, and I wouldn't be surprised if he were to claim the spot as the 3rd best pyro carry in the meta. To a slightly lesser extent, Diluc also benefited, in particular on his plunge teams. I was kind of skeptical about the synergy with Xianyun on these teams, because Xianyun does little animals worse every time the on-field character plunges, so I was worried she would make the cryo application inconsistent that way, but honestly works pretty well, and compared to the Vape teams, it's much easier for her to swerve pyro on these compositions, since you don't have to worry about Furina vaporizing it. Chaska, who isn't a pyro carry just in terms of formalities, benefited massively from Citlali as well. Chaska teams with Shenhe were already her best lineups since they enabled cryo shots for her that could sometimes melt and buff them. Citlali is just a much better Shenhe since she basically does the same thing, but we buff all of her infused shots much more and also shield her, of course. The only issue is that against bosses the cryo application will become rather inconsistent if you play her with Furina, since bosses can't be frozen, and so you will just have Hydra applied on them most of the time. As a result, I like using double pyro teams with Mavuika and Bennett instead of Furina, although these lineups definitely become stronger if you have Chaska Constellation 1. I could go on and on here, but the bottom line here is that unless your pyro carry is an extreme applier like a Huta for example, Citlali will be an upgrade for them that varies from decent to massive. It's not just about pyro carries though. You could argue Citlali makes the best Constellation 0 Nuvolette teams by virtue of having nearly the same offensive buffs as Shilonen while also shielding, which is more important for Nuvolette at that stage than having a bit more damage. As a last part, I want to talk about their higher investment options. I saw quite a few people say that their signature weapon is totally useless because Thrilling Tales, a 3-star weapon, can buff attack scaling carries to a similar degree. While this is true, Thrilling Tales can be clunky. In terms of rotation, not much, even though it forces you to use Citlali right before the carry, that's how you want things to be in the rotations to begin with, as it maximizes melt consistency for one. The actual limit of Thrilling Tales is that its effects can only trigger every 20 seconds, which can make it inconsistent in rotations that are shorter than that. Now, realistically, in a base there will be scenarios where you're wasting time, if you have to reposition or you have to wait for a boss phase, or simply due to human error, so the cooldown is more of an issue on paper than in practice sometimes, but it does make the signature more reliable at buffing the team. Moreover, it's of course much better for carries that aren't attack scaling, like Nuvolette or Molani, and it providing tons of elemental mastery make it the best option for increasing her shield durability as well as her own damage, so it's overall not the worst pull. The thing you should prioritize, however, is her Constellation 2. This Constellation is so strong from a supportive standpoint that you'd expect to find it on an Archon, honestly. More so for Melt teams, because while it increases her resistance reduction to 40, the main thing is the elemental mastery she provides, which of course only benefits Melt carries. Anyway, the impact is so big that getting Citlali to Constellation 2 will often have the same impact as carries getting their own Constellation 2, so if your pockets are big enough, this is an investment you could think about making. Seems like they've taken inspiration from Stariel with this one. Anyway, Citlali is really good, and she low-key revolutionized the meta with how she changed the picture for pyro carries in general. Definitely a high-value pull. And with this, I'm done for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and also go check the post-release video I made on Mavuika. Bye bye!